Welcome to Legal AF MTN, the home of all things law and politics in collaboration with the Midas Touch Network. Take a minute, free subscribe. Where's that logo? Free subscribe and help us get to 250,000 subscribers before Halloween. I got another amazing back and forth here, another hot take with Lisa Graves of Court Accountability Action and who heads up their research arm, True North. And we're going to talk now about something that I think has been little covered. There's a reason we on the this side of the aisle are talking about making this a crushing defeat of Donald Trump, have Kamala Harris not win by a little but win by a lot, make it too big to rig is my way of back at them saying we got to make this so big that we just put MAGA out of its misery once and for all. And that's because, and you and I were talking about this in sort of pre-production, I've referred to it as the difference between Terminator 1 and Terminator 2, except now the T is Trump. Trump 1 filed all the lawsuits through Team Crazy, captain of Team Crazy, Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell and Ken Chesborough and the rest of them after the election had already happened when they were trying to contest it with these various cases. There were 60 or 65 of them. They all effectively lost in advance. Now they've spent while you and I are brushing ourselves off and saying, thank God we saved democracy, and Joe Biden was certified to be the president, they have spent every minute since they got up in the morning brushing their teeth until they put their head on their bed at night, MAGA, I mean, trying to rig the election in favor of Donald Trump through voter suppression laws, trying to rip away your right to vote, voter registration laws, making it harder to vote, harder to register to vote. And then as T2, as Terminator 2 was worse than T1, T2 now is let's get the lawsuits all ready to go. They're sitting in the printers, just they got their fingers hovering over the publish button. They're ready to file these lawsuits. They're already taking over election boards at the county level, at the state level, right? Flooding. They're doing a full court press on election workers and election offices now and secretaries of state's office now claiming there's already fraud in the election that hasn't even been run yet. And I wanted Lisa to come on and talk about the lawsuits and then ultimately what's the call to action? What can we do about it? And what are the Democrats doing about it right now?
That's right. Back in 2020, as we were in the midst of that deadly pandemic, as Americans were dying, and these states were trying to figure out how to make sure people had the right to vote, how to get to, access your ballot. There were efforts in states to make it easier for there to be absentee ballots. And the Trump team was viciously fighting that, attacking that in state after state. But as you point out, both pre-election and post-election, the Trump team was basically staffed by some of the sort of least credible attorneys, making claims that were just not viable. Really an absurd amount of claims that the election had been stolen. Sidney Powell, Rudy Giuliani, and others, as you mentioned, people who were not considered credible by a bunch of other attorneys. But then what happened is on January 6th, it's not just that Donald Trump, issued that in essence call to arms to go get Pence to blame him for the electoral college vote count. But the fact was the other part of that speech on January 6th by Trump was about making changes to our election laws in numerous ways. And then lo and behold, groups sprung up to help move that forward, to basically launder the big lie that the election was stolen by pushing changes in states to make it harder for Americans to vote. And one of those groups is the legal alias of one of the core groups of Leonard Leo. You know Leonard Leo, people watching know Leonard Leo. He's the guy who Donald Trump outsourced the selection of the Supreme Court nominees to. He's the person who helped capture the U.S. Supreme Court by, getting Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh and Amy Coney Barrett installed, by helping them marshal money to push them through onto the Supreme Court. So here you have one of the core groups that's tied to Leonard Leo. It used to be called the Judicial Education Project. It then became the 85 Fund. That's the name of it in 2020. And then as Trump loses that election after that speech demanding that the laws be changed, basically to make it harder for Americans to vote, what springs up but an alias called the Honest Elections Project, HEP. And that group has been actively working to change the laws in the states in a lot of ways that, many people think constitute voter suppression, but not just change the laws, then litigate. So it's in the middle of lawsuits right now and amicus briefs right now to try to tee up cases for this US Supreme Court to possibly engage in a Bush v. Gore 2.0 scenario of the Supreme Court intervening in our election to install a Republican as president of the United States.
For those, just to give a little bit of background that are just joining late to our democracy, in Bush v. Gore one, we had the presidency was chosen not by the popular vote, not by the electoral college, but by 5 members of the United States Supreme Court who voted for various reasons, including those that were conflicted, for Bush over Gore. And you had a very honorable Gore who decided to bow out gracefully, probably before he should have, and conceded the election. Therefore, much to the chagrin of many of his followers and people that are working hard in the court system, and that led ultimately to the Supreme Court for the first time in our history picking our president after we hung in the balance. Was it 36 or 38 days?
Yeah,
Well,
it
we
was.
didn't
I
know.
think it was 36. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, I remember the New
36.
York Times. Yeah.
Yeah,
The New York Times was doing it was like a hostage crisis, like day 22, no president in
yep,
sight,
yep,
and
yep,
all of that. And that's very destabilizing, not just for our democracy, but for our relationships around the world and how the rest of the world sees us and our democracy. It's the old line about when America gets a cold, the rest of the world gets the flu. And when they
yeah,
see us and they're like, holy shit, that's what's happening with that well established, well functioning democracy. And so, Lisa, when we talk in shorthand about Bush v. Gore, let me just frame it here for those that are joining our democracy late or don't or aren't as detailed oriented about it as we are, and that's why we put together Legal AF to talk about these things. There, we had a president that was selected not by a popular vote, not by an electoral college, but by 5 members of the United States Supreme Court, 5-4, after about 36 or 38 days of it hanging in the balance, in combination with at least 3 of them had a conflict, probably shouldn't have voted at all because they were tied back to the Bush administration or the future Bush administration, in one way or the other. And then you had Gore at the time thinking he was doing the honorable thing, but he threw in the towel. And so between that and then getting up, the Supreme Court was like, well, he's out. Okay. Bush. I mean, that's sort of how it happened. And we thought, well, that's the first time in our American history that a Supreme Court has picked our president. I hope that doesn't happen again. And now we have what you just described, which is a new Supreme Court containing Clarence Thomas again, with a conflict again, with Ginny Thomas and him in a scandal, a series of scandals again, just now 20 years later, 24 years later, all over again, headed by a Chief Justice who has his own ethical problems and his own series of missteps and illogical, unconstitutional set of rulings over the last several years. Uh, so I no longer feel like the Supreme Court is the firewall protecting our democracy. Do you?
no, and in 2020, because the cases were, so random, and they included just such ridiculous claims, including claims that there were Chinese ballots and bamboo on paper, like it was just a panoply of just nonsense. The courts rejected Donald Trump over and over and over again. But since then, we've seen we basically seen some of these groups emerge that have people involved in them that are not from that same fringe, although they are part of the Maga sort of agenda. But you have another group that calls itself Restoring Integrity and Trust in Elections, RITE, that is being funded by a really super rich casino billionaire named Steve Wynn. And its team of leadership includes Bill Barr. It includes Karl Rove. And that group is led by a guy named Derek Lyons. Derek Lyons clerked for Brett Kavanaugh on the Supreme Court. Derek Lyons was the top sort of White House secretary for Donald Trump. That's the same role, by the way, that Brett Kavanaugh held during the part of the George W. Bush administration after Bush became president. So you have a guy named Derek Lyons who is leading that group, leading the charge to get a case to the U.S. Supreme Court. And what they want to do is they want to basically set aside any state court ruling that sides with voting rights. They want to basically kick open the door left open by John Roberts and Sam Alito in the case, the Harper versus Moore case, which was this really unprecedented, outlandish suggestion that only state legislatures could make decisions about voting, and that basically state courts had no role in protecting our voting rights, even though our entire system at the federal and state level is built on this notion of checks and balances, and that courts do have a role. And in fact, before Brett Kavanaugh was confirmed to the U.S. Supreme Court, his predecessor, Anthony Kennedy, Justice Kennedy, basically issued a ruling in which the court said, "Hey, we're not going to get involved in redistricting cases. We're not going to get involved in these sorts of cases." Case called Rucho versus Common Cause, but you can still go to state courts. Then, as soon as Kavanaugh gets on board, they basically start shifting the ground and suggesting actually you can't go to state courts. They haven't ultimately resolved that question, meaning they haven't issued a final dictate on it. They kicked the can down the road a year and a half ago, going on, I guess, going on 2 years now. Actually, they kicked the can down the road about a year ago, but now you have a group that's led by a former Brett Kavanaugh clerk, someone who was working previously with what? Leonard Leo's Honest Elections Project operation, teeing up cases to try to get this Supreme Court and Brett Kavanaugh and John Roberts, Clarence Thomas, Sam Alito, Neil Gorsuch, and Amy Coney Barrett to try to side with them in ways that would really have the effect of making it harder for Americans to vote, in essence, throwing out.
Yeah, I mean, I know that they fell in love with that independent state legislature thing. I think right Rehnquist had it as a side note in 2000, and they've been trying to use it as a way around. It's like, well, we don't like our Secretary of State. We don't like what he's doing. We don't like our county, our state board of elections. We don't like what they're doing. The only one that can make the ultimate, or judges, the only one that can make the ultimate decision is the woman or man that you voted for into your state house about federal elections, like you said, without check or balance. I mean, I mean, even this Supreme Court, as you said, in 2023, and recently in a case that came up to them through, I think, Pennsylvania, was like, no, we're not ready. We're not ready for ISL yet. Not yet.
Right.
Not yet.
Right. This independent state legislature theory is one
Yeah.
that's been cooked up, concocted in these sort of right wing fever dream groups to basically say, because they've been so successful since the 2010 census in doing these really, computer driven gerrymandering, where they can, basically go down to half a block on different streets in order to make sure that they are selecting who you get to vote for versus you getting to select who represents you. So this hyper partisan redistricting has become so potent that they now dominate some of these state legislatures, and also have had that effect in Congress in terms of the same sort of maps that have been drawn. And this Supreme Court, the Roberts Court, has basically allowed that to happen. For a while, they said, well, you can't do it on a racial basis. But then just this summer, in a ruling coming out of South Carolina, where there was uncontrovertible evidence that the white legislature of South Carolina bleached out the blacks from a particular voting district that they'd voted in for decades. The Supreme Court suddenly said, well, you can only strike down one of these districts on a racial basis if there were no other reason for doing so, like a partisan reason for making this map. And
Let's
so
put
this,
every.
yeah,
I didn't mean to interrupt. So let's
yeah,
put all the blacks in Clyburn's district,
yeah,
right? Because
yeah.
let's just make that super black. And then just let's just the Supreme Court can look America in the eye, all these white guys, and say, "Oh no, it's not. No, they weren't redistricted because they're black. They were redistricted because they're black Democrats."
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly what they did. And then, what that's meant is open season on these extreme maps. And why that's important is because this is happening concurrently with this effort to basically say only state legislatures should have a stay. Pardon me, only state legislatures have a say over our voting rights, even though what state legislatures do has always been subject to judicial review. So as they capture these state legislatures, they want to concentrate power in them. And we know, for example, that the Honest Elections Project has been the outsourced place for a group that I exposed early on called the American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC. I launched a project called ALEC Exposed. Basically, ALEC has outsourced the indoctrination of these state legislatures for how to, change voting laws to the group tied to Leonard Leo, the Honest Elections Project, which is the group now helping to bring litigation to tee it up for this Supreme Court to, basically harm our right to vote, and in harming our right to vote, affect the outcome of our election, in particular this presidential election that is of such consequence.
Next time we get to, thank God we have you and your institutional knowledge, all up here that you're able to share with our audience. It's so refreshing and rewarding to hear about it. And when you're on with me again, I definitely want to talk about the Voting Rights Act and why Roberts and Maga have such a hard on to get rid of it. I mean,
Yeah,
they're always pointing to, well, Congress, major decisions, Congress should have, Congress did speak. There
yeah,
is a law. It has sections to it. It's called they're all delicately balanced by a prior Congress. Why is it
right.
being rewritten out of existence by John Roberts and the rest of this MAGA? That's a cliffhanger. You and I will talk about, because we can do a whole show
Yes,
about the Voting Rights Act, right? And the
yes,
assault on liberty and Voting Rights Act in plain daylight, in broad daylight by the Roberts Court. Um, so listen, this is the beginning of an endless dialogue involving Lisa Graves, Alex Aronson, the founders of Court Accountability Action, True North Research for Lisa as well, right here on Legal AFMTN, as Alex once put it so eloquently over breakfast when the three of us met, or later on. No more screaming into the void. We have people to talk
yes,
to. We have
yes,
people, we have fellow travelers
yes,
here in the
yes.
audience, in the community that's being built by Midas Touch and continued by Legal AF MTN. Help this pro democracy channel reach its goals of having a large subscriber base. The bigger we are, the more your voice is heard. Take a moment. You're here already. Hit that oval subscribe button. Go. That's a vote that counts. No
Yeah.
provisional balloting there. Your vote counts. Go get friends and family, have them do the same thing, and then you'll keep this content coming to you uninterrupted. So until my next time together with Court Accountability Action and Lisa Graves, Michael Popok, Lisa Graves reporting. In collaboration with the Midas Touch Network, we just launched the Legal AF YouTube channel. Help us build this pro-democracy channel where I'll be curating the top stories, the intersection of law and politics. Go to YouTube now and free subscribe at Legal AF MTN. That's at Legal AF MTN.